Irish community is more concentrated in the middle. Iona, and just north of that, Newtown, the upper Newtown, and off to the south, heading towards Rhode Island, is a little district called the Valley. So generally tonight we'll be referring to these people here as the Iona Irish. We're not talking about the whole parish, really. Now we know that some of the Irish were found even lower Newtown and Norwood Cove. We don't want to neglect those, but they were concentrated here in upper Newtown, Iona, and Valley. So we talked first about the Irish immigrants, and we wonder why they came out here at all. Maybe we could say that there was a general lack of opportunity for many back in Ireland because of the shortage of land and the fairly large population of families. Maybe many were fed up with the British system and oppression. Some had the spirit of adventure, no doubt, because immigration from those areas was fairly common in those days. But many were out here already, working, and simply stayed. Others then would come because their family members were already settled here. The Newfoundland fishery was an important employment area for many Irish. Many of them came out to, I guess, the Grand Banks to fish, would fish for a season, go ashore, and fish another season and go home. And after a while, some started asking, why go back home now? Because some of their families were beginning to get settled over here, especially around Newfoundland. Some of them drifted off to the lumber camps of Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and some over to the island that way. The island's commercial ties with Newfoundland from early on were very great. Farm and other products were being shipped to Newfoundland, and often the boats would come back with passengers who stayed here. So many of our Irish in the Iona area came here by way of Newfoundland. And then many others came directly from Ireland, paid their own way, brought their skills, many of their possessions, and so on. We don't want to feel that the Irish were destitute, terribly poor. That may not be right at all. Now there's a little overhead of Ireland. It may not be too clear. Just to show roughly what counties they came from. Probably won't be able to read that too well. Mostly from the south and east, starting at Waterford County, Kilkenny, Wexford, Carlow, Wicklow, and no doubt some few from Tipperary, and so on, from the southeast. Most of these would have left from the port of Waterford, and a little bit later, a number of people came from the northern areas, Monaghan and Fermanagh counties, and they would normally leave from the port of Belfast. So mostly from the southern counties When did they come? Father Burke wrote short histories of almost all the parishes of the island way back in the 1880s, I think. These are very valuable notes, and he had 5 pages on the Iona parish. And according to Father Burke, the first Irish settler in Newtown was Pat Morrissey, who came from Waterford in 1820. The first Irish resident of Iona was Martin Daly from Wexford, who came over in 1826. From some of the tombstones in Iona Cemetery, we find a few references to their immigration date. Bridget Brennick from Waterford immigrated in 1828. Thomas Morrissey from Kilkenny in 1830. Terence McGarry from Monaghan, 1841. Mrs. Owen McCanna from Monaghan, 1840. And James McCanna from Monaghan in 1842. It's important to note that all of the Irish coming to Iona came out before the Great Irish Famine, which struck there between the years of 1845 and 48. It's important to note that because many people will still think that the poor, starving Irish came out at the time of the famine, and that is not true. Many again came out, they simply paid their own way, and were not, in a great sense, that poor, in a sense. 1841 is the first census we have that talks about families and the names of the children and the ages. There doesn't seem to be any earlier census for that here in Charlottetown. In the 1841 census, we find 157 natives of Ireland among the Iona Irish. 4 of those were tailors, 1 miller, 2 teachers, 1 tavern keeper, 1 carpenter, and the rest involved in farming. And the short note said that at least 20 of the men at that time of the census were presently in Miramichi working and would be home in the spring. The names of the Irish Iona families in the 1841 census were as follows: Brennick, Byrne, Callahan, Cody, Conley, Curran, Daly, Doherty, Farrell, Gill, Griffin, Gunnip, Kelly, Loughran, Morrissey, Murphy, McGarry, McGuinness, McMillan, Naddy, O'Brien, O'Connell, O'Mara, O'Shea, Power, Reddy, Roach, Ryan, Slavin, Stack, and Walsh. 31 families here already in the 1841 census. In the 1861 census, we find about the same, 153 natives of Ireland, and there are 14 new family names added by that time. Baird, Bulger, Clarkin, Dreelan, Dunn, Flynn, Lyons, Mullen, McCabe, McCluskey, McKenna, McTegg, Rooney, and Stevens. Now for the names of the community. We don't know exactly where the name Newtown came from, but it was there very, very early. We don't know exactly where the name Valley came from either, because The land in the valley is among about the highest on the island, even though maybe the school is down in the little valley, but we're not sure exactly where the name came from. What became known as Iona was first known as Montague Cross. Some even referred to it as Irish Montague, but Montague Cross was a fairly official name. Really, when we went to school, the schools were still Montague East and Montague West. They did not become Iona schools until about the 1960s. So it became known as Iona in around 1901 and named by Father James Phelan after the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland. So we had the northern tip of Ireland, England, part of Scotland, and Iona. Where is it here? Anyway, you get the idea. There's that little black dot. We have the outer Hebrides up here. The inner Hebrides, and Iona is in that group of inner Hebrides. St. Columba went to Iona Island in 563. The island is 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. It has rough grazing land, and sheep and cattle are raised there to some extent. And nowadays tourism is added to small-scale farming as an industry. As you can see, it's easily reached from Ireland by sea. Columba landed in 563 with 12 monks, and there he was to begin his Christianization of Scotland. He built a monastery and began the work of evangelization of the local inhabitants. And from Iona went missionaries throughout Scotland, northern England, and beyond. Columba died in 597, so he was there over 30 years, buried in Iona. Later, 300 years later, or 250, his remains were taken back to Kells. The monastery was burned and most of the monks were murdered. Later, in the 12th century or so, the monastery was rebuilt, and then in the time of Henry VIII, it, among many other monasteries, were suppressed and I suppose destroyed. In recent years, the island has become pretty much the terrain of the Church of Scotland, and there is an Iona community that's at work there, sort of ecumenical group of people who go there to pray, to work, and so on. They have built up the monastery once again. I presume it's the second monastery, and according to the latest census I can find, the population of Iona Island today is 120 people. They wouldn't need too many MLAs there. When the Scottish settlers came to Belfast in 1803, Lord Selkirk had already bought out lots 57, 58, 60, and 62. And obviously he made it available to those people to buy at that early age, at that early date, because most of the land was owned still by the proprietors. But Selkirk had already bought out a number of proprietors, and he owned those 4 lots. We're not sure yet, at least I'm not, if the Irish settlers were able to buy their land before the Land Act of 1875, which was a compulsory land purchase act. Whether they were able to buy their land before that, at least I don't know. Maybe they were still paying rent. But the Scottish settlers were able to buy their land outright early on. Speaking of Belfast and the settlers, we have to mention a word about the Belfast riot, which involved a number of people from Iona as well, which happened in 1847, not very long after they were settled there. There was a general election in 46, but violence at the poll brought about calling that election null and void. So a by-election was held in 1847, and it was at that election that the so-called riot took place. A number of people were wounded. We know for sure that Malcolm McRae of Pinnet died shortly after as a result of injuries. And 2 Irish fellows, James Kane from the Lot 66 and Michael Mulcahy of Sparrows Road, also died shortly after from injuries received that day. Some from Iona were in court or had to testify. As far as we know, no one there was charged. There were many factors involved in that riot. Generally, election days were occasions for much drinking. Voting was open. It was not a secret ballot. People knew how each one voted and how the tally was going. People from outside could come in and stir up the thing. No doubt there could be some religious overtones, Scottish and Irish, Catholic and Protestant, and so on. But perhaps a main factor could have been the land question itself. The sheriff read the Riot Act, and that ended the election that day. It was held a few weeks later, and the militia was out, and there was no trouble. Churches, first of all, the Iona Irish had to travel to Vernon River. There was a mass station at the house of Martin Daly, that first Irish immigrant in Iona. And then in 1852, the first church was built. That's fairly early, too. That church was burned in 1926 on New Year's Day. I think maybe some of you youngsters here tonight might remember that fire. The next church was built that year, and it burned also in 1959. Almost exploded in a ball of fire. And the third church was built that summer, and that's the little church that stands there now. So 2 churches were burned. Parish house was built about 1870. Makes it 125 or 125 years now. Some of the pastors, especially those who were residents, the first resident pastor came in 1884, and Father John Corbett was the first, followed by Father James Phelan, John Goody, Matthias Smith, P.S. Duffy, Charles McCarthy, Leonard McCanna, Willie D. MacDonald, T.P. Butler, Clifford Murphy and Lawrence Kiefer, and that brought it to 1986, and pretty much since that time, Iona has been worked out together with Vernon River Parish with the one pastor. It was on with Montague for a year or two also. The hall was built in 1914, had many interesting uses, and served as a church on 2 occasions following the 2 fires. The store at the Iona Crossroads began in 1875 by the O'Connell family, passed in 1893 to Joe McCabe, later went to Mary McCabe, and about 1963 it went to Leo and Florence O'Shea, and they kept it going until 3 or 4 years ago, which means that store was in operation about 115 years. The schools were Montague West and Montague East, and in the 60s became known as the Iona West and Iona East. And then later, when consolidation came, the students went to, and are going to Belfast or Montague. There were a number of priests who were natives of Iona Parish. First was Joseph Roach, who went out to Lincoln, Nebraska. James O'Connell went to Baltimore. William McKenna from Newtown went also to Lincoln, Nebraska. Michael Murphy from Newtown was a priest for Calgary and later went to Los Angeles. Pat McKenna labored for years in Kansas City, in Kansas State. Alphonsus Rooney went to Helena, Montana. James Rooney to Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And Philip, or sometimes called Philip Michael Rooney, went to Edmonton. That was 8 who went for other missionary dioceses. Another group from the parish remained in this diocese: Joseph Rooney, Michael Rooney, William McCabe, Phelan McKenna, Edmund Roach, Barnes Roach, and yours truly. 7. That's 15. And 3 others were born and baptized in Iona, lived their early childhood there, but moved to other parishes. As youngsters, they did not go to school in Iona. James Farrell, who was in this diocese, who died 2 years after being ordained. Eugene Rooney went eventually to St. Edmonton and St. Paul diocese in Alberta, and Patrick Rooney, who went to Edmonton. So if you look at that, it's 8 and 7, 15, and 3 others who were born and baptized there. There were 4 religious brothers, about a dozen sisters, congregations of Notre Dame, St. Martha, St. Joseph's in Minnesota, Charity, and Good Shepherd. Iona had 4 doctors from the place: Joe Daly, Pius McCabe were medical doctors, Art Daly and Frank McGarry were dentists. 1 lawyer, as far as I can see, especially in the older times, and that was Pat Mooney, who was admitted to the bar in Alberta. Many teachers, many went on for education. We must not remember, however, those who stayed home to work and those who went away to work and raising their families. They were extremely important also. We don't want to just single out those who got an education. A few of the personalities of the Iona Irish. First we'd mention is Patrick Stevens. Stevens was born in Dublin, or came out from Dublin, in 1842. And with him in his pocket he had a letter of recommendation from the great Daniel O'Connell. And this is the letter. It's a little bit faded. I'm just going to read it. I am called on to testify to the character of Mr. Patrick Stevens, now about to leave this city, and I am able very distinctly to state that his character is excellent, his conduct perfectly irreproachable, his abilities are very considerable, and have given great satisfaction to his employers. He will be found in every respect trustworthy, and he is also a steady teetotaler. I can safely recommend him as a truly honest, moral, and intelligent man. This was written from the Mansion House in Dublin on the 16th of August, 1842, signed by Daniel O'Connell, MP for the county of Cork, Lord Mayor of Dublin. Patrick Stevens opened or began a store at Orwell Cove. He was very influential in getting the first church built, contributed to it very well. His wife was Mary Matthew from Ireland, and her cousin, Father Theobald Matthew, was well known there and on this continent because he started the total abstinence arrangement which he saw as necessary and the best way to curb the drinking habits of many of the Irish. Many of the Irish who came to Iona had already taken the pledge from Father Matthew and were wearing the medal that he had blessed for them. So he was a cousin, possibly a first cousin of Patrick Stevens, his wife, Mary. Stevens was a merchant for quite a few years. He died suddenly on the wharf in Charlottetown, where he was in getting some stock. He was 54 years old. Another personality of note is Father James Phelan, born in Mooncoin in County Kilkenny, was educated at Carlow College, came out here when he was about 22 as a layperson, and immediately began to teach at St. Dunstan's College, which had just opened that year. He and Father Angus MacDonald were the two only faculty members. Later he was ordained and served in a number of parishes here. Before any resident priest came to Iona, Father James was the visiting priest for over 10 years and resident pastor for 17 years, 1891 to 1908. It was Father James who gave the community the name of Iona, as we said. He also gave the name of Fola to the railway station. The railway went through there, finished in 1905, so they didn't call the station Iona, they called it Fola, F-O-D-H-L-A, which means generally it's a poetic name of Ireland. Now, not all passengers and train crew were interested in poetry, and most of them mispronounced that name faithfully over the years, as many of you remember. Fadla was one of them. Father James was Vicar General of the diocese starting in 1895 while he was in Iona. On his 50th anniversary of ordination, he was named Monsignor, And when Bishop James Charles MacDonald died in 1912, Father Morrison was pastor at Vernon River, and he was named administrator of the diocese. But then he was named Bishop of Antigonish, and so they named Father James Phelan, now administrator of this diocese, until the arrival of Bishop Henry O'Leary in 1913. I saw two letters, Father James putting in his resignation. He's now 80. He's at Vernon River. And Bishop O'Leary writes back to him accepting it and reminding Father James that he is one of the best, most revered and loved priests in the whole of the Dominion. Father James died in 1915 at the age of 82 and is buried in Vernon River. James Daly, Sr., is another personality that I'd like to mention. He was a teacher. Then he went to study medicine as an older person in Dalhousie. And after his third year of medicine, he was drowned at Orwell with two of his cousins. They were out, I think, getting what kind of fish? Oysters. And the three of them were buried in the same funeral mass in 1895. However, he left two sons who became doctors. Dr. Joe Daly was Rhodes Scholar for Prince Edward Island in 1909, and he spent the next 3 years in Oxford. Dr. Arthur Daly, his other son, was a dentist, and the other family members of James Daly and his wife were very prominent and important people as well. The last personality that I have here is Pat Bulger. He was a teacher, taught in many schools, and from the inspector's reports we learned that he was somewhat better than average as a teacher. He was an outstanding writer, penman, and I was able somehow over the years to capture a couple of examples of Bulger's writings. So we have them here. They may not be too clear. Probably you can see them afterwards. It's not a very good copy. It's a very precious copy, though. I got that about 40 years ago from, I believe, from his sister-in-law, Mrs. Mike Bulger in Charlottetown. It's just Massey Harris Company, manufacturers of all kinds of farming implements, workmanship and quality on Excel, prices to suit the purchaser. Down in the corner, J. Lyons, who was an agent for some machinery. And notice he signs it, Montague Cross, August the 30th, 1904. Really, by then it was named Iona, but possibly some of them still refer to it as Montague Cross. Marvelous piece of writing. Here are just a few signatures I happened to find in an old house there. Little cards, little white cards. M.J. Farrell, P.J. Bulger, and P.J. Buchanan. He often got high praise for his writing and teaching, penmanship to his students. In one place it says, the inspector said Bulger threw away all the manuals and got his students to do a muscular movement, and he received high praise for that. Bulger was also a fiddler, and he made fiddles. I think there might be a few fiddles of his around the island yet. Sir Andrew MacPhail, in his book The Master's Wife, mentions in one chapter a few things about Pat Bulger. I think that's praiseworthy, coming from someone like that. Apparently MacPhail, that's the old house in Orwell that's still open, MacPhail tells about importing a large white stone, a long white stone, for a doorstep at his house in Orwell. Many came to admire it. Among its visitors was Pat Bulger, the last of the violinists, whatever that means now. The last of the violinists. He brought his fiddle and played a long composition of his own. The stone gave the effect of a complete orchestra. He goes on, Bulger would play the tune as it was commonly played, and then touch it up with the riches of his own inner imagination. MacPhail goes on, Bulger made his own fiddle. He also made one for me at a cost of $3. He talks about Bulger's playing the fiddle on the train. Often people would get out on the aisles and dance. That'd be great on the Murray Harbour train, especially on freight days. And when going through Scottish settlements, Bulger would play Scottish airs. Final reference here by MacPhail is that Bulger would bring his fiddle to the woods. Apparently they had people working in the woods at MacPhail's, and play traditional airs and compositions of his own, which had been well received at a theater in Boston. So Bulger must have played in Boston. Bulger died in about 1926, buried in Iona. He died about at the age of 64. I want to read this short letter, which I happened to find by accident in researching Father Burke's book. It's notes from Iona, a big double column spread. I'm just going to read it. It's 1904. The settlement of Iona, formerly known as Irish Montague, is one of the most charming spots in our island home. Situated midway between Vernon River and the southern terminus of the new railway, that's Murray Harbour, it bids fair to become before long one of the most important of our agricultural communities. Nature has not been sparing in her gifts. Everywhere you look, there is a pleasing variety of hill and dale, woodland and fertile field. Little brooks roll beneath the hillsides and laugh and sparkle in the sunshine. Every charm of nature is here to delight the eye and gratify the mind. I may here refer also to the adjacent settlements of Grandview and Valleyfield. Back to Iona, but it is mainly about the people that I desire to write in this article. Descended from Irish ancestors, long since passed away, who always cherished loving memories of the old land, it is only natural to assert that the present inhabitants of Iona are strongly imbued with all the traditions and characteristics of their race. The hospitality, the kindness of heart, the wit, all the predominant features of the Celt are in evidence on every hand, and in every sphere and vocation of life. The schoolmaster has been abroad, bespeaks the lively interest which must always have been taken in educational matters. The rod of discipline is at present wielded, when necessary, by Mr. Michael Connolly, a young gentleman of pleasing address and ripe scholarship. I may also mention the names of P.J. McKenna and P.J. Bulger, young gentlemen of the place, who teach in adjoining districts and who have won laurels for themselves in their chosen profession. The other trades and professions are in keeping too. The village blacksmith, Mr. L. Byrne, although young in years, possesses mature judgment and skill in matters pertaining to his craft. A good general store is also a necessity in an up-to-date community, and the wants of the people are supplied in this respect by Mr. J. McCabe, who in addition discharges the onerous duties of postmaster. Nor are the spiritual wants of the people forgotten. The pastor, Reverend James Phelan, is an ideal, don't know what that is, and has endeared himself to every member of his flock. The church itself, though not of modern style, is comfortable and neatly kept, while a beautiful lawn and shady trees surround the church and the parochial residence. Now here seems to be the clincher of the letter. But like every other rural community in the province, numbers of the young people leave it every year for the United States. How pleasant it would be if our young men and women could be induced to remain at home, where their mental and manual labor might be employed to advantage, profitable to themselves, profitable to the country itself. We are living in an age when depopulation is the order of the day on every side, and no effort is being made by the government to check its ruinous way by fostering some home industry for those seeking honorable employment. Whither are we drifting, and what will be the outcome? Iona, September 5th, 1904, signed Observer. We're getting to the end. I hope they have good tea. You'll need it. Just want to wind down by saying that even though the Irish were a little island surrounded by the Scottish people, I would, in my experience, say that we did not live in a ghetto. We had Protestant families in our community, not many, but 2 or 3, McRae's and McTavish's, which added a lot to the community. On our place, on our farm, we often had work done by tractor, which we didn't have. Tractors owned by Alf Weatherby and Joe Weatherby from the neighboring communities. Joe Weatherby was the first person I think I ever saw or heard saying grace. He'd come in for his meals and Joe would say grace. I have never seen that before, so he taught me that at least. Peddlers were fairly common through Iona. We had the haters for fish, Charlie and Ma. Gillis from Point Brim with meat, and the Fergusons and others. School inspectors, Billy Angus McPhee, Angus Gilmore, all non-Catholics, very nice and fine people. At Eldon we had Halliday's Wharf, Macmillan's Shore, we often went there. Dan McPherson's store at Eldon was a common place to go. Finlayson's Forge at Eldon, Angus R. MacLeod's saw mill on the Murray Harbour Road, Danny McRae's grist mill in Heatherdale was a very common place, and McGowan's store in Kilmuir were common visiting spots. Always some, as we say, Scottish cattle buyers around, constantly around. Lots of politicians. Many from the Belfast area would leave their horses in our stable when they went on the train. The hall had many events which drew non-Catholics, and even funerals quite often would have some non-Catholics as pallbearers. So I don't think, in my experience anyway, we could say that Iona was a little Irish ghetto. It wasn't. I have this little page marked My Iona, just reflecting on the area. We had a great country view, high land really, the sea for miles. The country has grown up a bit since, but when it was more clear, there was a great view from Iona. In our place, we lived right next to the, we had a stream on our farm and a bridge, very important natural elements. In fact, Iona had 3 streams crossing the road. The railroad went right by our barn. Railroad tracks, always interesting. The train, especially the steam engine, who would want to miss that? Train station, Fola, great gathering place, morning and evening. All kinds of travelers. And the house, the cemetery. Daly's illustration station, kind of experimental farm, where there would be lots of activity and a field day every year. The school was common, but a very good school, good teachers. Our neighbors were easygoing, friendly, humorous. A few of them were lazy. I don't recall in those areas a broken marriage or an alcoholic or anyone with mental illness. Final page. We would not want to view too casually the Iona Irish and the community they founded 150 years ago. It must have been a terrible experience for these people to move what was completely a world away, to sever their ties with their loved ones and their lovely country, that ancient land of beauty, faith, history, poetry. They had to conquer the forest, back-breaking labor, and after that the land was still only fair, hilly, and making a living on the farm in Iona was never far from a struggle. Yet they found strength in their common and community bond, in their common faith, in their good-humored outlook on life. I have not done any justice to these people tonight, but it's only a beginning, and we'll all have to work at it a little more. Thank you.
I think what we'll do now is take a break and give you some sandwiches and some Timbits, tea and coffee back there. Take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So if someone wants to get the sandwiches out of the kitchen and so on, we'll take a 10 or 15-minute break and come back then. Thank you.
I forget what year it was. I think it was 1864 or something. But I'd have to check that.
Would they be in Front River now?
Yeah, they would be.
Does anyone else have an answer to that question? Has anyone been doing family research? Maybe knows how extensive the records are? Oh, okay.
It should be there because there was no fire or anything like that. It should be.
I thought at the time that they had the celebration for the river, they were all taken out and sent to the shop.
Well, they all have been microfilmed all over the diocese, the old ones. They're available at the Chancery up here and at the, I guess at the Coles building, I think, too. All the baptisms were put on microfilm a few years ago.
I was interested in the connection between the Stevens man you mentioned and did he have a connection with another island family that probably is well known?
The McDonald's in Cardigan.
What was the relation?
See now. Father Clare MacDonald just died. His father grew up in Orwell Cove and left there when he was 12. After Stevens died on the wharf, his widow carried on the business for a few years. And then I guess they couldn't do it any longer, and some of them moved to Cardigan. Now that Father Clare MacDonald's father was 12 when the family moved to Cardigan. So he's connected. He would be a grandson of Stevens, wouldn't he? Yeah.
Father, that's correct. That's there. Mr. Stevens was Father Clare and Father Andrew's great-grandfather.
Right.
Andrew
Right.
the original letter, he had it with him when he was up in Father 65.
That's where I got that letter. That letter of recommendation by Daniel O'Connell,
Right.
and another one there that Father Theobald Matthew wrote to Mrs. Stevens, his cousin. I got those from Father Clare and Father Andrew some years ago. So that's the island family.
My old Stephen's store is still up at our corner, right?
Is it?
Yes. That's the original store. The building's there, I think.
Well, that's the Clark. That's old Clark's store.
There was a Stevens.
There was a connection between the Stevens and the Clarks, but I thought the Stevens store was down at the Cove.
Oh, maybe.
But they were connected somehow. There was a relationship there somehow.
Else a question? Where did the O'Sheas originate in Ireland?
We used to think it was Kilkenny, but in that early census, on the tombstone, it says that John O'Shea came from Kerry. That John, who was the first O'Shea, that's what it says there. He was from Kerry. We used to think they were from Kilkenny, but I don't know any more than that.
Thomas McCarthy was married to a Mary O'Shea, the great-great-grandparents, and Kerry was where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
They come from Ireland, they're very good.
I never did any research into those areas where they came from.
This Father Jimmy Farrell. My uncle used to speak of the Father Jimmy Farrell. He was a friend of his, and they used to go to university together at St. John's University years ago. I think it'd be around, well, the turn of the century or something. And this Father Jimmy Farrell went to the Grand Seminary. That wouldn't be the same man,
Yeah, he was born in 1897 in Iona, and they moved to St. George's about 1900. And then he taught school for 10 years, this James Farrell. Went to St. Dunstan's and graduated in 27, was ordained in 31, and died in 33. Yeah.
And you joined the Grand Seminary?
Yes, in Quebec.
Well,
Yeah.
Any final questions before we, gentleman over here? Yes?
Father, Tom, you mentioned the fact that maybe everyone would be very quickly, and I want to assure you that indeed they were. Although you may think of something less, but your presentation was very moving in that you literally painted a picture of growing up, the community growing up in the West, and as it was. And I'd like to think that some young people will be able to do that, our present-day community will be able to light in a place with such a simple beauty as what that you have done. And it's indeed very moving when you see it done that way. And one other thing I wanted to add, I don't know if you would have known or not, the Father James Salem that you spoke about, he was the priest that attended Father James up at the Kelly Cross when he died at St. Dunstan. And in his will, I guess Father Duffy had a certain amount of cash on him when he came into Bishop's residence during his illness. And Father Phelan had something in the range of £33 that he had to turn over to the estate that he was owning for Father Duffy. But I mentioned that's the same man who spoke of.
Someone mentioned here at the break about the other Phelan. There were at least 5 priests by the name of Phelan who served here. Father James had a brother, Father William, who served in Sturgeon and sometimes in Iona too. He built the church in Sturgeon. And then there was Father Thomas Phelan and Father Stephen Phelan, and there's a 5th one, I think. Now, in some cases, there was an uncle and a nephew arrangement there, and someone was talking about that at the break. I'm not sure which.
Father Thomas and Father Stephen.
Father Thomas was the uncle of Father Stephen.
Uncle of Father Stephen.
Okay, yeah.
He served in Pratt.
Yeah.
Reverend Thomas Phelan in 1865. My grandfather was raised at his residence on the 1871 census. He was raised, his mother had died, and he was raised by the aunt who was housekeeper for Reverend Thomas Phelan in 1865. He shows up on, my great-grandfather shows up in the 1871 census in the household of Reverend Thomas Phelan.
Now, he's the one who had to go back to Ireland for his health, and he died there.
Back in Ireland, his health broke down, and I have deeds home of Reverend Thomas Phelan gave my grandfather 1 acre of land and built a store for him. across from the Bonaventure Church in 1884. So sometime after that, he went back to Ireland, health broke down, and I think Reverend Stephen played a couple him back to Ireland. He also, Reverend Thomas had the two brothers, one was in New York and one was in Ireland. And the deeds that were signed by both brothers Thomas had.
If there are no other questions, I think Huey Campbell back there pretty well extended the thanks of the group here to Father, and I would just echo the sentiments that Huey passed on. Certainly, I found your remarks tonight very enlightening. Iona was not a community that I've had a great familiarity with, so I particularly enjoyed your presentation tonight. So thank you once again. As I mentioned earlier, and as a lot of you probably know, Father O'Shea has just finished a book on Reverend A.E. Burke, and we're already thinking that perhaps we'll have him back next year in this lecture series to speak about that very, very prominent individual. Just a couple of announcements, and then we'll conclude the formal part of this, and then if you want to stay around and mingle and talk a little bit more, you can stay until the cows come home, as the fellow says. Lady earlier on in the evening wanted me to mention that there's, and help me out, lady, there's a variety concert, a St. Patrick's variety concert on Sunday, March the 13th. Am I right? Where is it? Orwell Corner. Splendid entertainment. Mention a few.
Well, the MC will be Rev Arthur O'Shea, so
That's enough said right there. Urban's a showing himself. So turn out and support this worthy cause. There's a poster at the back of the hall there if you want to check it out. That's Sunday, March 13th, Orwell Corner. The other thing that I want to mention, just a reference to next week's lecture, we're turning the focus away from the island Irish community and we're going back to the old country. And Dr. Kay Deviney from UPEI is going to be talking about what is referred to as Ireland's National Theatre. That's the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which is associated with many of the great names in Irish theatre and actors and playwrights and so on. And she'll be talking about, I'm sure, about the origins of the Abbey and some of the great characters associated with it. It should be a very, very interesting lecture, so we would invite you all back to that next Friday night. So I think that's all I have to say, so thank you very much for turning out in the numbers that you have. We really appreciate having you. And if this is your first lecture that you've been to at the hall, don't let it be your last. Come again next week. Thank you very much. That's good, George. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.